Podcast. I'm your host, AB.
And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're covering the case of Jennifer Morey. And this case will make you question who you can trust as far as people in a place of authority goes, even when those are the people that are supposed to be there to protect you. Jennifer's story is luckily a survivor story. I felt like after the last few weeks' worth of cases, that we could just all use a story with a happier ending. So with all that being said and without further ado, let's get it. Jennifer Morey was living in Houston, Texas in April of 1995. She was 25 years old at the time, and she was doing extremely well for herself, especially for her age, because like I said, she was only 25 years old. But she had already accomplished pretty big things like becoming a lawyer, and at the time, Jennifer had just recently moved into a new apartment building. Jennifer had been looking around into different apartments shortly before her attack in April of 1995. And she'd finally chosen an apartment unit in the Bayou Park apartment complex. The complex was large, and it should have been perfect for a young single woman who was living alone. And it should have been perfect because this complex also included 24-hour on-site security protection with armed guards. Now, these security guards were kind of outsourced from the Pinkerton Security, which is a huge name in the security industry, and it's been around since the late 1800s. So the way this worked, from my understanding, is that the apartment building wasn't hiring these people to work as security guards, but instead, Pinkerton Security would send their guys over to the complex, and they'd do their 24-hour surveillance, and they would do these shifts of surveillance in shifts that were set up by Pinkerton Security. And of course, those 24 hours would be broke down into shifts for multiple people. But the 24-hour on-site security wasn't the only thing that sold Jennifer on this particular apartment complex, though. Sure, the constant on-site security was nice, but the Bayou Park apartment complex also had an 8-foot wall along the entire outside perimeter. The security of this complex was perfect for what Jennifer was looking for, and it was just a bonus that the complex was pretty close to downtown Houston. So Jennifer had actually been living somewhere else before she moved into this apartment complex in Houston. And she'd kind of taken a weekend to drive to Houston and just looked at a bunch of different apartments, and that's when she finally decided on the Bayou Park apartment complex. Jennifer signed her lease and she moved into her second-floor apartment. And she was settling in just fine. Jennifer got a call from a friend on April 15th, 1995 at about 10 p.m. This friend asked Jennifer if she wanted to go out with her and a group of friends to a bar called the Ale House, and Jennifer agreed to go. She worked long hours since her career as a lawyer was just taking off, and she deserved a night out with friends. So Jennifer meets up with her friend and they ride together to the bar, which again is called the Ale House. They get to the bar, they have a few drinks, and they even run into a few other friends that they knew. And Jennifer says on her episode of I Survived that they really did have a great night together. Jennifer had run into a guy, and after everyone was done hanging out, and it was time for everybody to head home, this guy had asked Jennifer if she wanted him to give her a ride back to her apartment, and Jennifer agreed to let this man take her home. And I already know where your mind is going, and let me just say, you're wrong. And I promise it's not what you're thinking. So, Jennifer makes it back to her apartment somewhere around 1 a.m. Jennifer goes into her apartment, locks the door behind her, and she went about her regular nightly routine as usual. And let me just be clear, Jennifer and her friends had gone out to have a few drinks and hang out. No one had gotten sloppy drunk where they didn't know what was going on or what was happening around them. So Jennifer was aware of what she was doing. She knows that she locked her doors. She knows that none of her windows were open or left unlocked. And I'm only adding that no one was sloppy drunk because I know sometimes people have a little bit too much to drink and maybe they go a little harder at times and then maybe they wake up the next morning and realize that they left their front door unlocked or their garage door opened or they'd lost their wallet the night before at the bar. But that wasn't the case here. Jennifer went about her nightly routine. She washed her face, she brushed her teeth, she changed her clothes, and she headed to bed for the night sometime after midnight. And we kind of know that it was after midnight because she'd been dropped off somewhere around 1 a.m., so she would have had to have gone to bed after that. Now, after Jennifer went to bed, she dozed off, and the next thing she knows is that she was being woken up from a pretty deep sleep, but she was being woken up to the feeling of the pressure of someone else's body weight sitting on top of her. And she says that she could feel someone tugging and pulling at her underwear trying to get them off. Jennifer was finally awake enough to think clearly, and that's when she realized that there wasn't just someone in her apartment, but whoever this was, they were also on top of her trying to get her undressed. So she can't move, and she's still pretty groggy and confused about what's going on, and then she felt it. A knife pressed against her throat. And Jennifer says during her episode of I Survived that it was at this moment that she put together what was actually happening. And she says that she just thought to herself, oh, I'm being raped. And Jennifer says that that thought was what woke her up, like jolted her awake, enough to be able to be alert, enough to know what was going on, and for her to know that she needed to fight back against her attacker. So obviously, Jennifer is yelling at this man, telling him to stop, and she's pleading with him, asking him not to hurt her. And she says that she just remembers the feeling of his thick, coarse leg hairs rubbing against her own legs, which skeeves me out, and I'm not sure why. Jennifer then tried to reach for the knife that was in the man's hand, but Jennifer recalled that when her hand touched his hand while she was trying to grab for the knife, that's when her attacker became completely enraged. And that's when Jennifer says that she took a pretty hard blow to the eye, and that all she could feel was the warmth of the blood running down her face from her eye. And this is when Jennifer says that she had her next kind of clear thought, and she was sure that this man had just cut one of her eyes out. But she still wasn't going to give up that easily. Jennifer knew that her best and only option at this point was to try to get this man off of her and to try to make it out of this alive. And now that Jennifer was focused on getting away from this man alive, she tried to look and see if there were any facial features or other identifiable things or marks that she could see about this man. But in all the darkness, all Jennifer could really see was that this man had short, straight hair. She couldn't really see anything else that she could use to later describe him if she was able to get out from under his grasp. So this is when Jennifer decided that her best option at this point was probably just to scream for her life. After all, she lived in an apartment building, so she was sure that somebody would hear her screams and call for help. Jennifer figured if she could scream louder and louder, that someone would hear and call the police. But as the screams continued, the intruder told her, "Jennifer, shut the hell up," which is terrifying because now he knows her name. This had to be someone who either knew Jennifer or somebody who had been watching Jennifer without her knowing. And Jennifer came to that same realization. She had been trying to study this man's facial features to be able to identify him later, but now that she realized that it was somebody that she knew that was attempting to rape her, it was even more weird because she didn't recognize this man's voice. She couldn't place a face with the voice to the person behind the darkness. Jennifer even says during her episode of I Survived that she was rattling off all the men that she could think of in her head, just trying to figure out who this voice could belong to. But she couldn't think of anyone who matched this man's voice. But right after he had used Jennifer's name to tell her to shut up, the intruder took his knife and he cut Jennifer's throat, presumably to stop her from being able to yell for help, but that didn't work. And it was when her throat was cut that Jennifer says that this was the first time that she thought that she might die at the hands of this intruder. Death hadn't even crossed her mind up until this point. Jennifer had already been bleeding from her eye, and the blood from her eye was going everywhere. And now she's also bleeding from her neck. And the blood from her neck was just, it's making a mess going everywhere too. This is when the man tells Jennifer to stop looking at him. Because remember, Jennifer's a lawyer. So everything that she'd ever learned and been taught was telling her brain to gather as much information about this man as she could so that she would later be able to identify him. But she says that she had to kind of fight against those urges to keep looking at this intruder. Jennifer tells the man that she won't look at him again, and she doesn't, because at this point, Jennifer knows that this man is capable of murder. He's proven that already with this violent attack and the use of the knife. So Jennifer does exactly as the intruder says. She fights against the urge to keep looking at him to try to get information. And this is when the intruder takes Jennifer and he drags her by her hair across the bedroom floor and into her bathroom. He then tells Jennifer to get into the bathroom. But when she got in there, this man went back into Jennifer's bedroom, presumably to get his knife that he'd left in the bedroom. But when Jennifer realized that the man was walking back into her bedroom and away from the bathroom, she slams the bathroom door. Then it hits her that this bathroom door doesn't have a lock, it's just a handle. So there's really nothing that Jennifer could use besides her own body weight to try to keep this door shut to prevent this man from getting back inside of this bathroom. Jennifer first tried to press her body up against the door, but she quickly realized that this man was going to be able to pretty easily use his body weight against hers to get the bathroom door open. She knew that that wasn't going to be enough to hold him off. But her body weight is really the only thing that she had at this point, and she had to utilize what she did have. So Jennifer then slides down against the back of the bathroom door and into the sitting position. She pushes her back against the door and presses her feet against the side of the bathtub, sort of using the force of the bathtub to her advantage. So I kind of want to explain this in case this part has confused anybody. So Jennifer would have been sitting with her butt on the floor in the bathroom with her back against the closed bathroom door. And she had her legs stretched out all the way out in front of her, and she was pushing her feet against the bathroom tub. Essentially, this man would have either had to have broken both of Jennifer's legs to get through the door, or Jennifer would have to let her feet come off the side of the tub, which she wasn't gonna do. So this would have given at least some kind of struggle as far as him getting into the bathroom that Jennifer was in. And it's when Jennifer was sitting against the door and the tub in the bathroom that she realized that earlier, what she had thought was the intruder had cut her eye out. This had actually just been a slash to her face. A pretty gnarly slash, but thank God it wasn't her eye. And even though Jennifer was sitting inside of a dark bathroom, she could tell that she was bleeding pretty profusely from both of those slash marks, one on her face and one on her neck. So Jennifer took the roll of toilet paper off of the toilet paper holder, and she just held the entire roll of toilet paper to the cut across her throat just to try to help stop some of the bleeding. Jennifer then recalled that it was kind of quiet inside of her apartment during this time that she was in the bathroom. She could still hear that the intruder was inside of her apartment, and she could hear him going through different things in her apartment. She could hear him moving stuff and picking stuff up, and then putting it back down. And then she could hear the sound of a zipper being zipped up, and what sounded like this man getting dressed. And then the entire apartment just got eerily quiet. And only after a few short minutes, Jennifer decided that there's really only one way to know if this intruder was still inside of her apartment or not, and that was to go check. So she gets off of the ground of the bathroom floor and she opens the door. Her hands are covered in blood, so much so that she couldn't even get a good grip on the door handle. And then when she finally did get a grip on the door handle, her body had been pressed so hard against that bathroom door and the tub that it had jammed the door. She was finally able to get the door unjammed and able to get enough of a grip on the door handle that she was able to get the door to the bathroom opened. Jennifer talks about when she was finally able to get the door to the bathroom opened on the episode of I Survived, and she says that she managed to get the bathroom door opened and that she crawled out of the bathroom on her hands and knees. But then she says that she remembered doing something so weird. She actually yelled out saying, "Hello?" And then she says that now she doesn't know why she was shouting a greeting to her attacker. But in all reality, she was just trying to hear if this man was still inside of her apartment or not. But her apartment was still so quiet. And Jennifer had planned on just trying to sneak out of the bathroom quietly and then trying to escape without her attacker knowing. But once she realized that she had jammed the bathroom door shut, she really didn't have a choice but to kind of be pretty loud and trying to yank it open. She knew that her only two options were to either yank on the door and make some noise or bleed to death in the bathroom, and those were her only options. But the lights were still off in her apartment when she dropped back to her hands and knees to crawl out of the bathroom. So Jennifer's first thought was to try to flip on a light switch so that she could see to get help. But none of the light switches in her apartment were working. And then Jennifer even says that she was wondering if she had forgotten to pay her electric bill. And she says that she was even thinking to herself like, oh good, I didn't pay my electric bill and they choose tonight of all nights to turn off my electricity. But then she makes it over to her landline phone because again, this was 1995. Everybody had a landline phone. But her phone line was dead too. And what Jennifer didn't know at the time, but something that we know now, is that the intruder had actually cut the power to Jennifer's apartment, and he'd also cut the line to her landline phone. And I'm sure that the intruder thought that by cutting off all of her ways to reach out for help, that Jennifer would surely lay in her apartment and die. But he was so wrong. Jennifer was way ahead of her time in 1995, because she not only had a landline phone, but she also had a cell phone. It wasn't glued to her hand like ours are today, and it was probably the old big block Nokia, but she had a cell phone nonetheless. And those old phones could hold a charge for damn near a month, I swear. But they also weren't used for every little thing back then, so that explains the battery life lasting so long. And it's kind of crazy because Jennifer's employer had recently given her this cell phone so that they would always be able to get in touch with her. And if it wasn't for that, she may not have even had a cell phone to be able to call 911 for help, which is kind of scary to think about. But once Jennifer tracked down her cell phone, she called 911 to report the attack. She made sure to lock her apartment door, and this 911 dispatcher needs a raise and maybe like a gold medal. And I'm going to try to play a clip from the very beginning of Jennifer's 911 call for you. I'm not sure how the audio quality will be, so we'll see.
Bloody FM presents Hometown Ghost Stories, a paranormal podcast that investigates a new town every week, bringing you all the hauntings, from haunted houses to castles, bridges to asylums, wandering spirits to demons. Over 100 episodes covering different towns all over the world. Tune in to Hometown Ghost Stories live on YouTube every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern or on any podcast platform and find out if your hometown is haunted.
Please help me. It's like it's trying to cut my throat. Ma'am? There's blood everywhere. I'm covered in blood. You knew my name. I don't know who it was. I know I locked the door. I can't even afford it. Okay, ma'am. Calm down. I know. Why are we so different? I don't know. We have some crazy people in this world.
So this 911 call is a little hard to understand, but Jennifer starts the call by telling the dispatcher that a man has come into her apartment and cut her throat. She tells the dispatcher that she doesn't know how this man even got into her apartment because she had locked everything up before she'd gone to bed. And then she tells the dispatcher that the man even knew her name. And she asks, why would somebody do something like this to me? And this 911 dispatcher, whose name is Richard, he needs a raise. He tells Jennifer that he's not sure, but that there are some crazy people in the world. But Richard was also able to calm Jennifer down, and he was able to gather information from her at the same time. Jennifer says that Richard, the 911 dispatcher, had kind of become her friend throughout this 911 call, and that he was someone she felt like she could trust. But it was about 10 or 15 minutes into this 911 call because this was an excruciatingly long 911 call. But at about 10 or 15 minutes into the 911 call, Jennifer hears somebody pounding and kind of knocking on her apartment door. So she tells Richard, the 911 dispatcher, that police are here and that they're knocking on her door. But Richard had become someone that Jennifer had grown to trust, and when she tells Richard that the police were at her door knocking, Richard lets Jennifer know that he can see where the Houston Fire and Rescue are on his screen, and that there are no first responding officers or EMS at her apartment complex yet. And you can hear it on the 911 call, not on the little portion that I just played you, but in other parts of this 911 call. You can hear that the man on the other side of Jennifer's door is saying like, "Hey, it's building security, let me in, I can help you," that type of thing. And Richard tells Jennifer that it is probably actually just building security at her door, but Jennifer tells him that she can't see anything out of her peephole. Firstly, she doesn't have her contacts in. Secondly, her eye's been cut. And thirdly, her face is covered in blood and she's still bleeding pretty profusely. So Richard tells Jennifer like it probably is someone who works for building security, but if you can't see them through the peephole, then do not open that door. Richard instructs Jennifer not to open the door to her apartment for any reason until he tells her to. And throughout this entire 911 call, you can hear that Jennifer's getting weaker, and I'm sure she is because she's lost a lot of blood. But after the security guard started knocking on Jennifer's door, from that point on, the entire time that Richard is on the phone with Jennifer, this security guard is on the other side of the door telling Jennifer that if she would just open the door, that, he could show her his badge, and he's still telling her his name and identifying himself as security. But Richard is consistently telling Jennifer not to open the door unless she can identify who's at her door, or unless she knows that it is in fact the police, which he knows it's not. And Jennifer recalled how insistent the security guard was about opening the door. He tells Jennifer that he knows she's been attacked by someone and that he can help her. And meanwhile, this whole time, she's bleeding and getting weaker. And what we'd learn later is that Jennifer's jugular vein was actually nicked when her throat was cut, and that aside from her throat being cut, that she had also been stabbed in the throat and in the arms a few times. And Jennifer's telling Richard this security guard is here to help, and help is what she needs at this moment. She was afraid she was going to die. And she was kind of afraid that she was going to die waiting on police and EMS to arrive. And then there's this man on the other side of the door who's telling her that he can help her. But Richard just keeps reassuring Jennifer that she is going to be okay, she is going to make it, and that police and EMS are on the way. And like I said, this was a painstakingly long 911 call. Like, more than 15 minutes. So I'm sure that had to have felt like an entire lifetime while Jennifer was waiting for police and EMS to show up. It got to a point where Jennifer wondered how her mom would be made aware of her attack and her possible death if she didn't make it out of this alive. And then finally, after what I'm sure felt like forever, there were suddenly tons of voices on the other side of Jennifer's door, and they're all identifying themselves as Houston Fire and Rescue. There are other men identifying themselves as Houston police officers, and finally, the 911 dispatcher Richard tells Jennifer that she can open the door and that it is police and EMS at her front door this time. Now, when Jennifer finally gets her front door unlocked, she just collapses onto the ground into the arms of help. And as all of these police officers and fire rescue are working on Jennifer and kind of trying to piece together what had happened, Jennifer overhears someone say that they also have an injured security guard, and that the security guard had been injured by Jennifer's attacker too. And hearing this news just kind of broke Jennifer's heart, because now she knew that she wasn't the only one who was hurt throughout this night's events. And this would have also explained how the security guard who had been knocking on Jennifer's door would have known that there had been an attack in the first place, because he had been injured trying to stop the attacker as the attacker was fleeing from Jennifer's apartment complex. This security guard was a man by the name of Brian Wayne Gibson, who had been working for Pinkerton Security since 1992. Brian explained to officers on scene that he had been patrolling his regular night shift at the complex when he witnessed a man jumping from Jennifer's second-floor apartment window, and that he had chased the man, a struggle had ensued, and the man had managed to get away from Brian. Brian had a wound on his right hand that was bleeding and blood on his face and on his uniform. Now, Brian says that as soon as he approached this man who had jumped out of Jennifer's window, that the man immediately started to attack him. which is how he ended up bloody and kind of disheveled looking. Brian says that he was able to get this man onto the ground, but then the man overpowered him and somehow slipped away. He tells police that after the man managed to get out of his grasp, that he went straight to Jennifer's apartment because that's the apartment that the man had jumped out of the window from. But Brian tells police that when he got to Jennifer's apartment, that he pounded and knocked on the door and tried to get her to let him in for him to be able to help her, but that Jennifer hadn't opened the door for him. Jennifer was taken to the hospital and treated for her wounds, and then there were a few remaining officers that stayed behind to do an initial walkthrough of Jennifer's apartment unit. And during this first initial walkthrough, police found a few different things that clearly did not belong to Jennifer, and things that were so obviously left behind by her attacker. Police were able to find a pair of men's underwear, a belt, a glove, and a knife. But the knife wasn't even the most damning evidence that police found. Because one other thing that police found inside of Jennifer's apartment unit was a Pinkerton security officer's hat. And if you'll remember from the beginning of this episode, the apartment complex used security guards from Pinkerton Security as their 24/7 on-site security. So at this point, police are like, we might need to re-interview this injured security guard because something ain't adding up and the math ain't quite mathing. So police are kind of like, hey Brian, buddy, we need to talk for a minute. Do you mind showing us your underwear? And well, what do you know, Brian Gibson wasn't wearing any underwear. And when the police asked Brian to lift up his shirt, Brian had a significant amount of defensive wounds on his arms and stomach. And of course, Brian is claiming that these marks are from his encounter with the man who had attacked Jennifer. But this doesn't exactly explain why Brian had defensive wounds and blood on his stomach, though. And it was even more weird because Brian also wasn't wearing his Pinkerton security hat, which was part of his uniform, which he was required to wear. So police asked Brian if he can just pull his boots off. And when Brian pulls his boots off, there was blood spatter on Brian's socks. And once police start to realize that the security guard, Brian Gibson's story wasn't exactly adding up, they walk through the path that Brian claimed that the intruder had jumped from Jennifer's apartment from. And there really wasn't anything that looked like someone had jumped from a second floor apartment window. And then from here, police wanted to check the spot where Brian claimed to have wrestled the intruder to the ground. And this would have also been the spot where the attacker would have gotten away from Brian. But when police walked to that scene, there was no disturbed grass, no evidence of an attack, and nothing found that pointed to anyone being in that spot that Brian pointed out at all, which is weird. So as you've probably put together by now, Brian Gibson, who was the security guard for the apartment complex where Jennifer lived, was her attacker. Brian had even gone so far as to shave his pubic area in an attempt to make it harder for police to collect DNA evidence. And I've always wondered about this case for a few reasons. One, because DNA wasn't the end-all be-all that it is now back in 1995. And secondly, why did Brian leave in such a hurry? Like, he drugged Jennifer into the bathroom by her hair and then just left. It wasn't like she could have called for help from 911 from her bathroom. Like, why didn't he just get all of his shit together before he left? I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm glad he did leave all this evidence behind, but I just don't know what his plan was supposed to have been. It doesn't make sense to me. And police kind of speculate that Brian had left in a hurry and then realized that he'd left all of this incriminating evidence behind in Jennifer's apartment, so they think that when Brian was beating on Jennifer's front door while she was on the phone with 911, that Brian was actually attempting to get back inside of Jennifer's apartment to not only collect all of the things that he'd left behind, but also to finish what he'd started with Jennifer. Possibly planning to kill Jennifer since he would have known that she was still alive because she had been talking to Brian through the door, but thank God for Richard the 911 dispatcher telling Jennifer not to open the door and just to wait for police. Because that is for sure what saved Jennifer's life, and this made so much more sense as to how Brian was able to gain entry into Jennifer's apartment even though she knew she'd locked all of her doors and windows. And it would also explain how Brian knew that no one else would be inside of Jennifer's apartment. Because he did this night shift all the time. This was his shift. He would have known that she lived there alone and that no one else lived there, like she didn't have a roommate or a live-in boyfriend. But once police had Brian on the top of their suspect list, they learned some interesting things about him and his performance history while he'd worked at Pinkerton for the last couple of years. Because Brian had plenty of complaints during his time at Pinkerton that he should have been fired a long time ago before he ever had a chance to attack Jennifer. 26-year-old Brian Wayne Gibson started with Pinkerton in 1992, like I've already mentioned. And in the 3 years that he had been working for Pinkerton Security, he had been moved from 2 different assignments before his placement as a security guard for this apartment complex. He had been removed from those 2 assignments for getting into arguments with different people. And then his last relocation before he was moved to the apartment complex was at a construction site where a client had reported that Brian had used their vehicle without their permission or knowledge. There wasn't any charges pressed on Brian for essentially stealing someone's car, but it was after this report about Brian using someone else's car at the construction site that he was working for that Brian was relocated to the Bayou Park apartment complex where Jennifer lived. And that was really kind of shitty just for the simple fact that the 24/7 security and the 8-foot-tall fence around the complex had been one of the biggest selling points that had sold Jennifer on signing the lease in this complex. She had looked at multiple apartments. Those were the few reasons that she'd chosen the Bayou Park apartment complex. She was actively looking for the most safe and secure apartment that she could find. And she thought she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for, and then this happened. And this only happened because Pinkerton did not fire Brian when they should have. Because every time something happened at a job location with Brian, Pinkerton just moved him to another location instead of firing him. They just moved him and moved him and moved him, and if they would have just fired him, then this attack could have been prevented altogether. And once police walked through Jennifer's apartment to actually take in the scene and start collecting evidence, they found that there was blood from floor to ceiling on the bed sheets, the walls, just everywhere. And all of the police and fire and rescue and EMS, they all came to check on Jennifer at the hospital, where they told her that they could not believe what kind of fight she had put up. They were impressed, to say the least. Her attacker had not successfully been able to go through with the rape because of how hard Jennifer fought him off. But once Jennifer was checked out at the hospital, doctors and nurses were amazed at how incredibly lucky Jennifer had gotten. The nick to her right jugular vein was mere millimeters away from being deadly. And that cut had been so incredibly deep that doctors said that they also could not figure out how the nerves weren't severed that controlled Jennifer's facial muscles. But by some miracle, they were still intact. And the cut to Jennifer's eye had started on one eye and went all the way across the bridge of her nose and into the corner of her other eye. But somehow that cut missed both of her actual eyeballs. Jennifer said, quote, "There was a series of little miracles that prevented me from dying." And that's incredibly true, considering that one of the cuts or slashes to Jennifer that should have hit her larynx was stopped by a chain that she was gifted by her mom as a graduation gift. So it was just one small thing after the next that kept Jennifer alive that night. And I'm about to really piss y'all off, so just bear with me for a second. Because it was later learned that approximately 20 different people inside of 15 different apartment units had been woken up by Jennifer's screams that night, and not one single person called police. Not one single person called 911. Not one single person came to knock on Jennifer's door to check and see if she was okay. Not one single person out of the 20 or so people who were woken up in the middle of the night to blood-curdling screams even attempted to help. And this is what's known as the bystander effect. The bystander effect is something that we've talked about before on this podcast, but for anyone who's new here or to anyone who doesn't know what the bystander effect is, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown. The bystander effect is something that we all do whether we realize it or not. For instance, you're driving down the highway and the car in front of you is swerving from side to side and crossing the yellow lines, and they're clearly under the influence of something. Drugs, alcohol, something. But instead of calling the non-emergency line, you tell yourself that someone else will call and report this driver for endangering other people's lives on the road. Or you tell yourself, surely a police will get behind him or see him swerving and they'll pull a car over. But what if they don't? Another example is that maybe you're inside of a Walmart and you see a man with his finger in a woman's face and he's grabbing her arm and, he's talking, in this angry voice, making threats, and you can hear all this and you can see him jerking her around in the way he's talking to her, but you just keep your head down and you walk past the couple because, this doesn't have anything to do with you. You walk by as if you don't even notice. Because, you don't want to get involved, and surely a Walmart employee or another shopper will step in and help this woman. But what if they don't? The bystander effect is telling yourself that someone else will call for help. Someone else will do it. You're thinking to yourself that someone else will step in and help, or someone else will intervene or de-escalate the situation. But what if they don't? What if no one does? So always, 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 if you see something, say something. You might just save a life. Jennifer believes that Brian Gibson was put into a situation similar to that of a kid in a candy store. He was put into a position where he could scout out what he wanted and what he liked, and he could pick his favorite flavor and execute his attack. Brian Gibson was charged and convicted of aggravated burglary with the intent to commit sexual assault. And he was thankfully sentenced to 20 years in prison. I don't think that was quite enough time, but it's a lot better than it could have been, especially with the way that our justice system works sometimes. But at this time, Brian is actually out on parole, which is terrifying. If you're in Texas, y'all be careful out there. Jennifer went on to file a lawsuit against Pinkerton Security, and it was during this lawsuit that Jennifer's lawyer found that there were about 130 different Pinkerton employees between the years of 1991 and 1995 that had been charged and convicted of multiple felony charges. Jennifer's lawyer, who helped her in this lawsuit against Pinkerton Security, says that Pinkerton just didn't really do their due diligence when hiring new employees. Brian Gibson had lied on his employment application, and no one ever checked to verify anything that Brian put on this application. He didn't even have a GED like he claimed when he applied for this job. But nobody ever checked that either, because if they would have, that would have been the bare minimum requirement to apply for this job, which he didn't have, so he wouldn't have been able to get this job. Pinkerton Security has made improvements and updates to the vetting process for the security guards since this attack and this lawsuit. Jennifer went on to win that lawsuit against Pinkerton Security for an undisclosed amount, and she then used that amount from the lawsuit to open her very own private family practice law firm, which that is an incredible accomplishment. And it was only 2 weeks after the attack that Jennifer moved her things out of her apartment complex and she moved in with her mom. And while Jennifer was recovering and living with her mom, she says that she was constantly paranoid and she would call 911 at the slightest noise or scare. She also had pretty severe anxiety and she never slept, because instead of sleeping, Jennifer says that she would just walk the floors at her mom's house, checking in every room to make sure no one was in the house with them that Jennifer didn't know about. Jennifer was luckily able to snap back and move forward with her life eventually, and she opened the practice that I mentioned, and she's super active in sharing her survival story and making people aware of how easily something can happen, even when you do everything right. Because Jennifer did everything right. She found an apartment complex that was supposed to be safe and guarded by professionals, she made sure to lock her doors and windows, and she was still attacked inside of her own home. So she's made it her mission to inform as many people as possible about staying safe and what to do if you're ever put in this situation. Now, as far as Richard goes, Richard, who was the 911 dispatcher that Jennifer was on the phone with for that extremely long 911 call, the two of them actually met each other after this whole ordeal was over, and they became fast friends. They remain friends to this day, and Jennifer is quoted saying, quote, "Having instincts, intuition, and a big heart, he saved my life, and for that, he will always be one of the most important people that's ever impacted my life." Richard and Jennifer are actually such good friends that Richard even attended Jennifer's wedding, which I don't know why that sounds so wholesome and pure, but I love it so much. Jennifer was married and moved on with her life to do more good than what evil was done to her. And that is about the best outcome that you can ask for in a case like this. And with that, I think that's all I have for you this week. Before we do a review of the week and I get out of here, I want to thank a few Patreon members who've signed up recently. If you want to sign up, there's always a link under every episode. You get extra episodes, ad-free episodes, you know the drill. So this week I want to thank Sharia. I said it right this time, girl. I got you. Sarah, Missy. That's my mama, y'all. She finally joined. Hey, mama. And Linda Bradley. If I missed anybody, y'all let me know. Y'all know I'm unorganized and I can't keep up with this stuff. Let me find a review of the week and we'll get out of here. This week's review comes from Facebook from Anita Bates. It says, I love the way you tell it just like it is. Your podcast tells it like I would tell it to someone I know, keeping it real. And if y'all don't start putting some reviews in, your girl's going to have to start skipping some weeks like I've been doing. I don't know what else to do. All right, y'all, I got to go. Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.